Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll just give it a minute or two for people to filter in. Okay, I think we can get started. Kia ora koutou. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tim Crownshaw. I'm a senior advisor in the Research, Evaluation, and Insights team here at EECA, and I'll be the host of today's session. So over recent years, we've seen growing interest in and uptake of solar photovoltaics or solar PV in New Zealand. In this context, EECA is actively seeking to empower energy users with greater understanding of the value of solar. Equally, we know that improving the state of knowledge is valuable for many of you in the solar and electricity industries and related sectors. We're pleased you could join us for the first of two webinars, unpacking some of our recent research on this topic. Today's session covers the results of a detailed modeling project considering the value proposition of residential solar and storage. The second webinar in 3 weeks' time will provide an overview of customer perceptions and experiences regarding rooftop solar. So while prior EECA research has considered the commercial scale solar, much of the enormous potential that remains for this technology lies in the residential sector. So what sets this research apart in our view is the production of unique insights using high quality irradiance and demand data across a very broad range of residential circumstances. And this extends far beyond what prior studies have been able to achieve. Providing the best available knowledge in this space is foundational to EECA's role as an authority and to our mandated goal of increasing the utilisation of renewable energy resources in New Zealand. To carry out this research, EECA partnered with Dr. Alan Miller, Director of Alan Miller Consulting and co-founder of ANSWER, both of which are recognised leaders in this field. So I'll now hand over to Alan to present the project and its findings in detail. Alan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Kia ora koutou. I'll move on to the contents of today's presentation, and I'll start by looking at the background and aims of the study, the methodology we adopted in the study, move on to look at results, and then finish off with some conclusions. So moving on to background and aims, firstly, as Tim referred to, solar has seen dramatic cost reductions and uptake across the world in the last 20 years especially. But New Zealand has one of the lowest residential uptakes in the world. We're about 108 watts per person as of the end of last year. That compares to 1,200 in Australia, the highest per capita in the world, I think. But it also actually compares to 8 watts per person in 2015 in New Zealand. So we've come a long way, but still a long way to go. There's about 68,000 ICPs of the more than 2 million ICPs, mostly with solar, and most of those are residential. So as Tim also referred to, it represents significant potential for growth and renewable energy generation. So the aims of the study were to examine the economics of residential rooftop solar and look at the value proposition of distributed solar with and without storage. In order to do that, the methodology we adopted was to model use a model that measures the self-consumption of exports of solar energy from a household, and from that work out the rate of return, and then progressively add storage to that to understand the impact of storage and calculate the rate of return. So there's an example here in the middle of the slide, a graph of, on the y-axis is generation or demand in kilowatts. And then this is a 1-day sample across a 24-hour period. The blue line there is the household demand. The yellow area is the self-consumption of solar, and the orange area is the generation, giving the exports or the excess of solar that's exported to the network. We did this for 4 cities, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and Queenstown, and that's to match some other solar work done by EECA, as well as select 3 large population centres and a growing city. Now, when we come to analyse solar in this way, there's a lot of different data sources required. On the top left there, we need to know household consumption, and that varies considerably by household. So we needed to consider a lot of different households. We needed to know the solar resource by location or by city, and the generation from that. Also by configuration of the type of solar installation used. And then on the top right there, we needed to know the costs of a solar installation, as well as battery costs or the costs for other storage as well, and maintenance costs. And then also really important to the whole equation are electricity prices. The retail price giving the self-consumption cost saving on electricity bills, and the buyback price giving the export credits on electricity bills. So I'm going to go through just briefly over the next few slides, each of these, starting from the top left there, going from household consumption to solar resource to installed costs, and then electricity prices. So on household consumption, we took 47,000 load profiles from across those 4 cities. The only information we knew about those load profiles or households was the city they were from and the postcode. Other than that, no demographic information or appliance information about the houses was available. Ideally, we would have had that and used that kind of information to form the loads into a different, into clusters of different types of consumer. But because we didn't have that, we used some characteristics of the load profiles themselves to divide them into 8 representative load profiles. And the graph there shows an example of the representative load profiles. We ended up using, there's actually a whole appendix to the report deals with the determination of these clusters. And we tried many, many different parameters. It was a matter of, in the end, determining parameters that would give the tightest, smallest clusters, so less intercluster error, but also the greatest separation between clusters, while also ensuring we didn't have too many clusters for the analysis. And we felt that the selection of 8 clusters using a daytime demand ratio, which is the ratio of daytime demand, 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., to whole day demand, and morning peak ratio, which is the ratio of 7 a.m., well, actually the ratio of peak determined by the distributor in the city to whole of year to average demand. And then the other characteristic we used was evening peak ratio. An example of load profiles is given here. On the Y-axis is demand in kilowatts. The x-axis is time of day. And you can see this demand has quite a high morning peak. Actually, it has a very high morning peak ratio and quite a high evening peak, what we classified as a high evening peak ratio, and also a very high daytime demand ratio. There's a lot more demand during the day than there is during the night. So that classified this into one particular cluster. The other aspect of demand we considered when forming clusters was a winter demand higher than summer demand. Moving now on to solar generation. The base case we considered for the type of system was a 30-degree tilt from horizontal, so, well, a roof with a 30-degree slope, because the panels are almost always mounted directly against the slope. A north-facing roof and a PV panel capacity 20% higher than the inverter capacity. That's a point we'll come back to a bit later. Then obviously not every roof is a 30-degree tilt and not every house faces north. So we looked at some sensitivities on that, from a 15-degree roof to a 45-degree roof. Also northwest facing panels, and we selected another variation of half east and half west facing. The reason for doing that is I often get asked, would it be better to face half the panels east and half the panels west, because then you get more morning generation and more evening generation. The appendix, there is an appendix that deals with this whole solar generation and covers the impact or the effect of facing half east and facing half west, and whether it does give a better return. The answer actually is no, simply because in the winter during the peak period, morning and evening, there is no sun at the very start of the morning peak and the end of the evening peak. There is literally no sun. And this is another point we'll return to later with regard to battery storage. We also, in the sensitivities, looked at matching the PV panel capacity to inverter capacity. So just on that point, throughout this whole study, we have deliberately oversized the PV panel capacity compared to inverter capacity. Very quickly, and this table is in the report, there's some other variations of this table in the report. So if you want to have a really good look at it, I certainly don't expect you to look at all these numbers now. I just wanted to point out the numbers that are highlighted there. These are AC capacity factors. You can see that Queenstown has a very good AC capacity factor, followed by Auckland, then Christchurch and Wellington, pretty similar, in that base case of a 30-degree roof north facing. So moving on to PV and battery costs. So we looked at actually five different installation capacities. I've just shown three of them here. The capacities we selected were based on common inverter sizes primarily. The costs of those installations here are shown here. The information used to provide these or obtain these costs was from a variety of sources, including a CAN's survey. You can see that there's some pretty, compared to 2015 roughly, when solar installation cost was over $3.50 per watt, some of the costs there have come down. We do believe there's still significant room for costs of solar to come down further. We costed a diverter in at $1,200 and a timer in at $400. And batteries, we assumed or used a cost of $500 per kilowatt hour. Actually, the retail cost of a battery now is actually over $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So we've deliberately halved that on the basis that we would see and expect battery costs to decrease. That is at a 70% depth of discharge, so the actual cost per unit of storage is about $714. And we did test vehicle to grid as well. We didn't include the cost of the electric vehicle battery, but we did include a vehicle to grid inverter cost of $6,000. On electricity prices, I'm not going to actually show the prices used. They are in the report, and there's a whole appendix that deals with a separate document that deals with the derivation of prices in some detail. But the three price structures we used most commonly in the study were an existing day-night price structure, and the numbers in the brackets there, by the way, refer just for reference to results later on in this presentation. An existing 9 p.m. to midnight free price structure, a complex time of use price structure, which is really just a peak price during the peak periods, an off-peak price, and a nighttime price. And it generally matches what some retailers are offering in the market now. And we also considered a complex time of use price with a seasonal variation, where winter prices are higher than summer prices, on the basis that as more solar generation, as we get more solar generation, we'd expect to see lower prices in the summer, higher in the winter, which also actually follows demand trends already. For buyback price structures, we used a flat price structure. And again, the letters in the brackets here refer to the results later on. We also used a complex time of use price structure, which some retailers are now offering. And that matches the same time periods as the retail price structure. And again, a complex time of use price structure with seasonal variation. By the way, that's a higher price in the winter and a lower price in the summer, with winter being defined as April to September inclusive. So the studies carried out, we looked at PV storage first on its own. PV on its own without storage. And we looked at the return by load profile type and PV capacity. Then we moved to PV with storage technology and looked at the return by load profile type and storage technology. We also looked at given PV capacity. That's in the report. I'm not going to, that is for a given PV capacity. Then we moved on to look at PV with battery storage only and more complex retail price structures, and looked at return by price structure and PV capacity. That was for a given load type and a battery capacity. Finally, we looked at PV with battery storage and more complex retail and buyback price structures, and looked at the return based on peak buyback level. That was actually fed into some work done by the Electricity Authority. But we also looked at energy exported and demand reduction during peak periods. That was of particular interest to us from the point of view of how PV with battery storage might benefit or lead to peak load reduction and therefore reduce network investment requirements, peaking generation requirements, and benefit all users on the network. So results, first set of results, this is a graph of internal rate of return versus annual consumption. So what we can see from this is there's a very clear increase in rate of return as annual consumption of a household increases. The primary reason for that is increasing self-consumption of solar energy as the annual consumption increases. It's interesting in this to see the order. Queenstown has the highest rate of return, then Christchurch, then Auckland, then Wellington. That's a complex set of reasons for that. One set is solar resource, another set is prices. If we were to only vary the solar between those cities, the order would actually be Queenstown, Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington. If we only vary the prices between cities and kept the solar constant, the order would be pretty much the same as what we see here. And the report goes into that in a bit more detail. Looking at rate of return versus PV capacity, and in this case, using a simple time of use energy and distribution price. So that's the day-night price, a constant price during the day and a constant price during the night, and a flat buyback price. We see quite an interesting result, which is that the highest return PV is actually at the lowest capacity. Well, I would just make the note too that these returns are above 10%. And in the case of the darker line at the top there, which is a 12,000 kilowatt per hour, 12,000 kilowatt per annum consumer, it's a very good return, and a good return, still a very good return actually for the green line, which is an 8,000 kilowatt per hour per annum consumer. The primary reason why we see that reduction as the PV capacity increases is that there is more self-consumption with a smaller PV system in the middle of the day when the prices are higher. So what we're seeing is a greater offsetting of retail price, a higher retail price in the middle of the day. However, if we move to a complex time of use structure, which arguably is where retail prices are trending, in the next graph, we see two changes. One is a lower rate of return, and the other change we see is a reversal of the trend where we see higher rates of return at higher PV capacities. So the reason for the lower rate of return is a lower off-peak price in the middle of the day. So the solar is now offsetting the self-consumption in the middle of the day, which is when most self-consumption occurs, is offsetting a lower retail price. The reason for the trend in increasing rate of return with solar capacity is now that there is more buyback, the buyback price and the retail price in the middle of the day are now closer. So export of solar actually provides some better return compared to the lower capacity solar on the left-hand side there. What we also see is the darker lines here are for a 5 kilowatt export limit, which a lot of distributors have. If that export limit was lifted to 15 kilowatts, which is generally speaking the same as the fuse size of a typical single-phase residential installation, we see quite a big improvement for the higher capacity solar. And that's simply because they're able to export more. They're not being restricted in their export of solar energy. So moving on to results of PV with storage. And we've looked at, and this is a graph of internal rate of return again, but this time versus load type or cluster. We've looked at a number of different types of storage, from a diverter, a timer, a 5 kilowatt hour battery, a 10 kilowatt hour battery, and vehicle to grid. Firstly, looking at a diverter, it's quite clear to see that in most cases, the diverter does provide an improvement in rate of return. There are some cases where it doesn't, and that's appears to be related to the load type or the characteristics of the load. But we also see that a timer doesn't provide such a great improvement in rate of return. In fact, it reduces it. That's unique to a 5 kilowatt PV installation. If this was a 10 kilowatt PV installation, the timer would actually improve the rate of return. The reason for that is there's a greater likelihood of solar generation in the middle of the day when that timer switches on. What we also see is in quite a few cases, a 5 kilowatt hour battery providing an improvement in rate of return, but oddly, a 10 kilowatt hour battery actually reducing rate of return. The reason for this is it's unique to this size of consumer, 8,000 kilowatt hours per annum, and solar capacity size. So what is actually happening here, and the report goes into this in a bit more detail, is it's simply not possible to use the full capacity of that 10 kilowatt hour battery, whereas the 5 kilowatt hour battery is being used to its full capacity. So in the case of the 10 kilowatt hour battery, it drags the rate of return down because you've got a higher cost for the battery, which is not being used to its full extent. What we're starting to see here emerge here is a very complex picture of load type, solar capacity, battery capacity, and distribution price that all factor into the rate of return. So we think it's important to provide consumers with some support in choosing the best type of solar and storage system for them by, for example, enhancing their EECA solar tool. And finally, vehicle to grid generally doesn't give a great performance. The main reason for that is that it was only available, in this model, the vehicle was only available for 3 days a week. If it was available for 7 days a week or even 5 days a week, we would see a big improvement. In fact, in a number of cases, vehicle to grid would improve above the 5 kilowatt hour battery. I'd note that the vehicle to grid has the cost penalty of a $6,000 vehicle to grid inverter, which is really what drags that down. So moving on from there to sensitivities. This is along the x-axis here, we have change in base case return. In this case, the base case is a 10.5% return. And the percentage change there is a percentage change of that 10.5%. We have at the top here on the left-hand side, the factor that gives the biggest change is PV cost. We can see there's some quite big changes on rates of return there, with a plus 20% cost or a minus 20% cost on the base cost of a system. Giving similar results is a change in real electricity price to both retail and buyback prices, giving some very big changes in rate of return. And then next is orientation of the PV system. The worst result for the half east, half west there at minus 22%. And then facing northwest, it's minus 11%. So you can see that a north-facing system gives the best results. The next one is moving the ratio of DC to AC capacity down to 1 instead of 1.2, which is what was used in the base case. And it actually gives quite a large reduction in return. The reason for that is that the additional DC capacity comes at quite a relatively low cost. A new panel, or each panel with the associated racking equipment, is not a huge cost on top of an existing system if you have the roof space. And then finally, it's the tilt. And yes, it does give some decrease in performance and some improvement in performance at 45 degrees. Actually, this picture does change as you change the prices. So a seasonal price would probably give an even bigger performance improvement for a 45-degree tilt. And because we don't have storage in this case, we don't have sensitivity for battery cost. There's a lot of factors feed into improving solar performance, and we've tried to summarize some of those on this chart here. On the y-axis is improvement in rate of return, and this is a absolute percentage point improvement. So you add that to the base performance of a PV system. And on the y-axis is the how easy it is for a householder to control these parameters. So on the left-hand side, it's very difficult, it comes at a high cost. On the right-hand side, it's relatively easy to control. So it comes at a low cost. So if we look at the factors on the right-hand side, start off by adding a hot water diverter or timer. We're looking at a rough, maybe a 1% improvement in rate of return, so adding 1% to the rate of return. Oversize the array capacity, that would add maybe 1.5% or more. And I'd note that these are additive, so you can do both of these things, all of these things actually. Then even better in improvement in rate of return is to select the best available retail plan for you. And on the top there is obtain competitive installation quotes while ensuring high quality components. And I think ensuring high quality components is a really important part of this. But again, I'd make the point that this is complex for a user to do on their own, and some sort of tool that helps them make these choices would be really helpful. In the middle here, we have electrify demand, especially hot water heating and transport, to increase annual consumption. And that relates to the point that you'll remember back to the graph that showed return versus annual consumption, with a clear increase in return as annual consumption increases. By electrifying more demand, you increase annual consumption. We certainly wouldn't advocate increasing annual demand for, just for the sake of increasing annual demand. We're advocating here increasing it to electrify, to transition to low carbon technologies such as hot water heating, storage hot water heating, and transport. And also note that they have their own benefits, which are not captured here. And also add an appropriately sized and controlled battery or vehicle to grid. Then on the left-hand side, things that are really hard to change are your roof orientation, or your house orientation and slope of your roof. Some people might be tempted to tilt panels up to a higher angle. I think that's going to come at a higher cost with some other complications as well, such as wind loading. It's often better just to mount them directly against the roof of the house. And if you do have a low slope roof, just put more panels on. The impact of retail and buyback price on peak demand is the last set of results I want to look at. And as I mentioned earlier, this was of particular interest to us to understand how the combination of PV and battery storage could be used to decrease network or peak network and peak generation costs, and thereby share the benefits across all users on the network. So I have here a graph of average demand reduction in kilowatts, and that includes both demand reduction and export versus month of the year. And for the line shown there is for a 5 kilowatt PV system with no battery and a 5 kilowatt export limit. Because it's a 5 kilowatt system, the 5 kilowatt export limit is actually immaterial here. And what we see is, yes, there is some demand reduction in those winter months, about 0.25 kilowatts. And that comes about through the sun shining in the latter part of the morning peak, possibly in the early part of the evening peak. If we then move to a time of use energy or a time of use retail price with a flat buyback price, we see that the demand reduction during the peak periods does improve. So we get about a 1.5 kilowatt demand reduction in the winter. We notice that that is flat over the year, and the reason for that is the buyback rates are flat over the entire year. Then what we're going to look at next is the combination of time of use retail price and a time of use buyback price. So if we introduce that, we see that we get even more peak demand reduction in the winter, about 2.25 kilowatts. But we also see that we get higher peak demand reduction in the summer. And that's the reasons for that are a combination of higher buyback prices in the peak periods and more solar generation available in the summer. We don't necessarily want higher generation or demand reduction in the summer peak periods, but we do want it in the winter. So next we'll introduce a time of use buyback and retail price that also has a seasonal component. So slightly higher price in the winter and a lower price in the summer. And that does result in lower peak demand reduction in the summer, but continued roughly the same peak demand reduction in the winter. So as I mentioned earlier, there's about 68,000 homes in New Zealand with solar. If they had batteries and those batteries were controlled appropriately or had appropriate control systems that responded to time of use prices, that would give about 150 megawatts of peak demand reduction. But as I mentioned, there are caveats on that. They need to have batteries. They need to have time of use retail and buyback prices. And the batteries need to respond to those prices. So I'll move now on to conclusions. And first conclusion is that there's a clear increase in the rate of return of PV as household consumption increases. And that's directly relevant to electrification because that will lead to electricity consumption increases. Residential rooftop solar does provide a means for consumers to lower their electricity bills, particularly as they move to more energy consumption. We know from the study that a significant number of households will benefit from solar. The rates of return are pretty good, actually very good in some cases. Something interesting, though, is that latitude is not necessarily the determinant of solar return. So Queenstown, for example, has the best return. It actually has the best solar resources I showed earlier. Other places like Central Otago, the Mackenzie district have very good solar resources. The far north also has very good solar resources. Hawke's Bay, Bay of Plenty. Pairing battery storage with solar improves the matching of local electricity use and solar PV generation. Time of use prices with appropriate peak definition are vital to gain suitable battery responses and thereby achieve peak load reduction. And that delivers the benefits as outlined above to consumers. The cost of a PV system and batteries have a major impact on return. Retail prices also have a major impact on return. Batteries are frankly currently too expensive to provide net economic benefits for many households, particularly lower consumers and those who contribute little to peak demand. So I think we need to see more cost reductions in batteries in the market. Over $1,000 a kilowatt hour, it's just far too expensive. There is a risk of coincident household demand and export causing rapid shifts in aggregate network load. What I mean by this is as those batteries respond to price structures, the 9 p.m. to midnight free, for example, there's a risk that household demand will increase substantially at 9 p.m. And amongst many households on that pricing structure, it will then lead to new peaks on the network. This is sometimes called herding or synchronous demand, and is a problem worldwide, and one we want to avoid in New Zealand because it will only add to costs in the network. And I think even the peak period time of use price structures, we need to look at those carefully and ensure that we don't get these new peaks occurring. Finally, as I alluded to a number of times throughout the presentation, understanding returns from PV, especially if you add storage to it, is a multi-dimensional problem, and it's just difficult. We can't expect consumers to do that, so we think they need a tool that will help them assess this. That could, for example, be achieved by extending the EECA solar tool to include batteries and to use a consumer's actual load profiles. They actually add a few more things to that, such as more and different retail price structures. So I'm going to finish there and hand back to you, Tim.
Great, thanks very much for that, Alan. So just a few things to note as we wrap up today. Please keep an eye out for the final report for this research project, which we aim to have up on the EECA website next week. We also have a brand new residential solar calculator designed to provide households with an indication of the suitability of solar PV for them, given the power bill and details of their available roof space. And you can find that on our GenLess website. Finally, please join us for the second webinar in this series at the same time on May 1st, which will explore consumer perceptions of solar PV. So thanks very much to everyone in attendance today. We hope this session has been both informative and useful. So with the remaining time we have available today, I'll open the floor to questions. Please feel free to use your mic or type any questions into the Q&A box. So I've got a question here about sharing the presentation. Yes, we do plan to send out the recording for the session to all of the invitees. So you should receive that in the coming days. Getting hold of the report prior to next week. It's unfortunately still in the final stages of designing and polishing. So we will make it available on the website as soon as possible. Question here for you, Alan. Do you think that decisions regarding rooftop solar PV are made mainly on rate of return? Is this a deciding factor for many?
I think it's one factor amongst a number of factors. I don't think it's the only factor. Although, when you come to do a study like this, it's the one thing that you can sort of definitively point to in terms of what are the factors affecting solar from a consumer's point of view. I think the next webinar deals with some of the other factors, Tim, people's perceptions on solar. But a lot of times, I think people will install solar for reasons other than rate of return, such as contributing to renewable generation. I think that's a pretty common reason, really.
Yes, the second session will definitely go into a lot more detail regarding those drivers and consumer journeys about what motivated them to install solar. But definitely return is one key part of the picture. So another question here about the geographic impact of specific network peak tariffs and what impact those might have. So the idea that we may be able to target specific areas of the network that are constrained, and what impact this would have on the return for the customer.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we might start off with fairly statically designed peak periods and prices, but over time, I think they will need to move and move as demand shifts and move as demand changes on the network, or certain parts of the network become constrained. I think it's still moot as to whether that's done with prices or some other mechanism of control. In an ideal world, it would be very nice to be able to price by different parts of a distribution network to reflect peaks in a more dynamic way and have batteries respond to those. I think that's a future state. And where we need to begin is with good static peak retail prices and buyback prices, and I'd note that some retailers already have moved to those.
Great. Another interesting one here, and one that I've received a number of times as well. What are the main reasons why oversizing the inverter relative to the array has better overall returns?
Okay, it's actually the other way round, sizing the array bigger than the inverter.
Yes, yeah. My
Yeah.
apologies.
And the reason for that is so you're adding extra capacity into your PV system at a lower per unit cost. So a panel, for example, might cost $1 per watt, or less, whereas the overall system might cost $2 or more per watt. So just adding extra panels increases your capacity at a lower per unit rate. It will lead to something that's referred to as clipping, where the DC capacity or output reaches the inverter output and it can't produce any more. That's particularly in the summer, but actually in the winter, especially with lower slope roofs, you'll probably never reach that inverter limit anyway. So it really does make sense to oversize DC capacity, especially for the winter.
Great. Another question here. Are you looking at what return on investment is available to those who could put up mini solar farms on lifestyle blocks and on farms? I can just briefly add a comment here. There is an interest at EECA to look at agrivoltaics, and there's a recognition that there's a lot of promise there, but it is somewhat a different set of drivers and issues, different constraints relative to what we've covered in this particular research project. But Ellen, any additional comments on that front? To what degree the current results that we're looking at are applicable to, say, smaller, larger arrays than what we're looking at here on lifestyle blocks and similar situations?
I would go back to the graph of return versus consumption, and if your farm or lifestyle block has a very high consumption, then it's likely that your return's going to be better than what's shown here, and so maybe it would be advantageous to put in a larger system, just with the proviso that your network connection is able to handle that. So you may have an export limit from your network, for example, so just be aware of that.
Quite a big question here. Quite expansive. What policy choices could support rooftop solar? So what if the gentailers in particular prioritize large-scale renewable investment over household solar and price accordingly?
Well, firstly, I think there's always going to be independent retailers who need to source energy, and not necessarily from the gentailers. So there will be a market for selling rooftop solar there. The other thing to consider, I think, is the seasonal price structures that we included in the study, which were partially to try and understand what might happen to prices as more solar generation comes on stream over time, which includes those gentailers building larger utility scale solar. So those price structures reflect a lower price buyback price in the summer than in the winter. In terms of policy choices, I can't really comment on that. I think we have a market where gentailers invest as they see fit. But I'd come back to the point that there's independent retailers who need to source energy as well.
The next question is regarding EECA's goal for increasing the use of domestic solar. Is there a specific target? And to my knowledge, there isn't a specific number, but solar is covered in detail in both our statement of performance expectations and our statement of intent, which covers a longer period of time. And there certainly is a strong focus on supporting, largely through the lever of well-informed and engaged energy end users. So that's really one of the main angles where we're exploring projects such as this to provide a more complete set of information, which will enable households to make their own choices, as well as various efforts to engage those households directly to get that information out there. So, no specific target, but certainly an ongoing focus, and that is unlikely to change anytime soon. I'm just looking through the questions here. One for you, Alan. When referring to time of use pricing, you said that it was undesirable to have excess solar export in the summer. From a security supply perspective, would this not allow more storage to remain in the dams and then have more hydro supply available for winter?
Yeah, good point. I was really referring to, historical operation of solar of hydros. I think as time goes by, there is the hydro reservoirs could be used more and more for storage of solar. Obviously, that's up to the gentailers who own hydro and how they want to operate them. But I think that it is a good point that actually it's not necessarily undesirable to have more solar export in the summer, because if it could be stored in those hydros, then that would be a good use for it. And actually, just on that, also, I think if you do find you have very excess solar in the summer and very low prices as a result, I'm sure that there'll be other uses spring up for that excess solar.
Yes, we're particularly interested in the co-benefits that come out of solar, and more engagement from households and end users is certainly something that we're hoping to encourage and unlock over time. So we're getting towards the end of the questions here. any further insights on how EDBs can effectively benefit offsetting or reducing their large cost and costly network upgrades?
Um, I think it's useful to look at what Aurora Energy did in the Upper Clutha, for example, and I think Powerco's done some similar things in the yeah, I can't remember where uh, they've pulled together large numbers of these resources to provide network cost reduction benefits. I think the point that I'm really making here is that by providing very well-defined and clear time of use prices that include not just time of use retail prices, but time of use buyback prices, you're sending a signal, distributors and retailers are sending a signal over time to ensure that those with solar do export and reduce demand during the peak periods. So over time, a larger and larger resource of these systems that reduce demand during peak periods will build up.
All right, so one final question here, and it's right on time. Uh, Particularly interesting one. So, your point around herding of consumer demand when we move those peak periods to other times. Um, so, what countries and jurisdictions are experiencing this currently that you're aware of, and what are the measures that can be used to alleviate this problem?
Um, so I think Australia is experiencing it to some extent, and I know that they're worried about this, particularly in the UK. In terms of solving those, I don't have all the answers, but I think some of the answers lie in battery control and ensuring that batteries don't all respond at the same time. I think as we move to more dynamic pricing, that might be able to be achieved. But what I'm really saying here is I think the industry needs to put its heads together to work out how to avoid this before it becomes a real problem. And Tim, I notice there is one last question there on the impact that household solar can have on the 1 in 10 year low hydro inflow problem, which I wouldn't mind answering to, if that's all right.
Sure. We're at time, but I think we should be able to cover that final question.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. The combination of residential solar and battery storage, to be honest, is simply not enough to store energy from one season to another. But solar, from the analysis I've done through my company Answer using our solar model and hydro inflows, we have shown that solar does increase in output when you have low hydro periods. And it kind of makes sense. Low hydro is usually associated with a high over the country, less cloud, more sunshine, more solar. Right at the moment, it's the amount of solar we have is so small that it's insignificant. It doesn't make a dent in the hydro inflows. But as we get more and more solar, we could have gigawatts of solar. It does start to make a difference. So it's not actually the storage from household solar that would help there, but it's the increased output during lower inflow periods that could be helpful. I don't think it'll provide the only solution, but it could help.
Great. Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. We are at time. So what we're seeing is a very complex picture, but a lot of potential in this technology and definitely something we want to continue to drive forward. So thanks again to Alan. Thanks for everyone and to everyone in attendance today. And please join us in 3 weeks' time. We will also be sending around the session recording. So keep an eye out for that and feel free to share with anyone who is interested. All right. Thank you. Ka kite.
Thanks.